Imagine you're more likely to die in war if you're a grocery store cashier than if you're a trained soldier with body armor and a rifle. Imagine that being a school teacher in a conflict zone is statistically more dangerous than being a combat marine. This is the mathematical reality of 21st century warfare, and the numbers are as shocking as they are undeniable. Welcome to modern warfare, where the defenseless have become the primary targets, and where the ancient code of protecting non-combatants has been not just abandoned, but completely inverted. Let's start with the numbers because they tell a story that Hollywood war movies never show you. In World War I, a conflict so brutal it was called the war to end all wars, civilian casualties made up roughly 40% of total deaths. Already a dramatic increase from historical norms, but still, soldiers were bearing the primary burden of warfare's cost. By World War II, that figure had jumped to approximately 50%. For the first time in human history, non-combatants were dying at the same rate as combatants. But here's where it gets truly disturbing. In modern conflicts, civilian casualties now represent 80–90% of all war deaths. Let that sink in for a moment. 9 out of every 10 people who die in today's wars never chose to fight. They never signed up. They never took an oath. They were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, except that wrong place has become everywhere. The Iraq War provides a stark illustration. Conservative estimates suggest over 200,000 civilian deaths, compared to approximately 4,500 American military deaths and roughly 10,000 Iraqi military casualties. That's a ratio of nearly 10 civilian deaths for every military death, a complete inversion of historical patterns. In Syria, the Syrian Network for Human Rights documented over 230,000 civilian deaths between 2011 and 2021, compared to approximately 175,000 combatant deaths. The Syrian conflict didn't just kill more civilians than soldiers, it systematically targeted them. The evolution of warfare, from honor to horror. To understand how we arrived at this point, we need to travel back in time. For most of human history, warfare was like a deadly sport played by professionals on distant fields. Medieval knights fought other knights, following elaborate codes of chivalry that explicitly protected non-combatants. Even during the massive Napoleonic Wars, civilian casualties remained relatively minimal compared to military losses. Think of it like this. Historical warfare was like a boxing match between professional fighters in a ring, with spectators safely in the stands. Modern warfare is like detonating a bomb in the entire arena, where the spectators become the primary casualties. The transformation began during the American Civil War, when General William Tecumseh Sherman pioneered total war tactics. His march through Georgia deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure, farms and homes. Sherman understood something that would forever change warfare. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it. He realized that destroying an enemy's society could be more effective than just defeating their armies. World War II completed this transformation. The London Blitz, the bombing of Dresden, the siege of Leningrad, and ultimately Hiroshima and Nagasaki all represented a fundamental shift where civilian populations became legitimate military targets. The atomic bombs alone killed over 200,000 people, virtually all civilians, in a matter of seconds. Winston Churchill, defending the bombing of German cities, stated, "The fighters are our salvation, but the bombers alone provide the means of victory." Victory, it seemed, now required the systematic killing of non-combatants. Today's conflicts have moved from remote battlefields to city centres, from distant plains to residential neighbourhoods. It's like the difference between a controlled explosion in a quarry and a gas leak in a suburban home. The environment determines the casualties. Urban warfare has become the norm rather than the exception. The United Nations estimates that over half the world's population now lives in cities, and by 2050, that figure will reach 68%. When conflicts increasingly take place where people live, work, and go to school, civilian casualties become inevitable. But here's the disturbing truth. In many modern conflicts, civilian casualties aren't just inevitable, they're intentional. Syria provides the most documented example of systematic civilian targeting in modern warfare. The strategy became known as surrender or starve, deliberately besieging civilian areas while cutting off food, medical supplies, and basic necessities. Hospitals weren't accidentally bombed. They were specifically targeted using double-tap strikes that first hit medical facilities, then struck again when first responders arrived. Dr. Zahir Salul, who worked with medical organizations in Syria, described the targeting. They weren't trying to hit military targets that happened to be near hospitals. They were deliberately targeting hospitals to destroy the healthcare system and force surrender. Physicians for Human Rights documented 595 attacks on healthcare facilities in Syria between 2011 and 2020. Their report concluded, the systematic targeting of medical facilities is not collateral damage. It's a war crime that has been weaponized to force surrender through the destruction of civilian infrastructure. The logic of civilian targeting. Why would military strategists deliberately target civilians? The answer is as coldly calculated as it is morally reprehensible. Targeting civilian populations serves multiple strategic purposes that traditional military engagement cannot achieve. It's like the difference between defeating an opponent's army and destroying their entire support system. One wins battles, the other wins wars. Economic warfare through civilian targeting can be highly efficient. Destroying a power plant that supplies electricity to millions costs less than maintaining a prolonged siege against fortified military positions. The multiplier effects mean one successful attack on civilian infrastructure can have impacts equivalent to dozens of military victories. Population displacement serves strategic objectives by denying territory to enemy forces and creating refugee burdens for neighbouring countries. It's a strategy as old as ancient warfare, but executed with modern efficiency. Create enough civilian suffering, and entire populations will flee, leaving empty territory for easy occupation. Professor Alexander Downs of George Washington University documented this phenomenon. Leaders target civilian populations when they believe the costs of doing so are lower than the costs of alternative military strategies, and when they believe civilian targeting will achieve strategic objectives that direct military action cannot. The psychological dimension is equally calculated. Terror bombing, first systematically employed during World War II, was explicitly designed to break civilian will to continue supporting the war effort. The logic was simple. If civilian populations suffered enough, they would pressure their governments to surrender or negotiate. Technology, making death more democratic. Modern technology has democratized warfare in the most disturbing possible way. It's like giving nuclear weapons to street gangs. Advanced destructive capability in the hands of actors who may not follow traditional rules of engagement. Precision weapons create a paradox for civilian protection. While individual weapons may be more accurate than ever before, their availability to a wider range of actors has increased the overall destructive capability in conflicts worldwide. A terrorist organization today can acquire weapons that would have been available only to major military powers just decades ago. Drone warfare epitomizes this contradiction. While proponents argue that drones allow for more precise targeting, the psychological impact affects entire civilian populations. Living under constant surveillance and potential attack changes behavior patterns across entire communities. The Bureau of Investigative Journalism estimated that between 2004 and 2020, US drone strikes killed between 10,000 and 17,000 people, with civilian deaths comprising 25% of the total. But these figures don't capture the psychological impact on the estimated 1.2 million people living in areas subject to drone operations. Research in Pakistan found that 91% of children in drone-affected areas showed symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. It's like creating a generation of traumatized civilians without ever declaring war on them. The human shield strategy. One of the most cynical developments in modern warfare is the deliberate use of civilian populations as human shields. It's a strategy that turns civilian protection laws into weapons against those trying to follow them. Armed groups increasingly operate from civilian areas, hospitals, schools, residential buildings, knowing that military responses will likely cause civilian casualties. When those casualties occur, they become propaganda victories for the very groups that endangered civilians in the first place. Hamas's use of civilian infrastructure in Gaza, ISIS's operations from hospitals and schools in Iraq and Syria, and similar tactics by various groups worldwide represent a systematic weaponization of civilian protection principles. General Martin Dempsey, former chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, described the dilemma. When your enemy deliberately operates from civilian areas, there are no good options. Every military response risks civilian casualties, yet failing to respond allows attacks on your own civilians to continue. It's like a hostage situation scaled up to entire cities, except the hostage takers want their hostages to be harmed to achieve their strategic objectives. Children, the most vulnerable targets. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of modern warfare's civilian focus is its impact on children. UNICEF data shows that children account for approximately 1/3 of all civilian casualties in modern conflicts, a figure that would have been unthinkable in historical warfare. In the Syrian conflict, children accounted for 35% of civilian deaths according to the Syrian Network for Human Rights. Over 29,000 children killed in a conflict they had no role in starting and no power to end. The targeting of children is often deliberate rather than incidental. Schools are bombed not just when they house military assets, but because education systems are seen as strategic targets. It's like targeting the future itself, eliminating not just current opposition but potential future resistance. Malala Yousafzai, who survived a targeted attack for advocating girls' education, observed, "They shoot a child. They think that by this action they can stop us." But they fail to understand that when we speak of education, we speak of hope. They are shooting at hope itself. The recruitment of child soldiers adds another dimension to civilian targeting. UNICEF estimates that over 250,000 children are currently being used as soldiers worldwide. It's a strategy that transforms victims into perpetrators while destroying childhood itself. The future. Getting worse. Before it gets better, several trends suggest civilian casualties may continue increasing. Climate change will create resource competition that particularly affects civilian populations. Urbanization means conflicts will increasingly take place in dense population centers. Technological proliferation makes destructive capability available to more actors. The convergence of these trends creates what Professor Michael Clare called a perfect storm for civilian casualties in future conflicts. But the trajectory isn't inevitable. The same human ingenuity that created precision weapons and digital warfare can develop better civilian protection mechanisms. The challenge isn't technical, it's political and moral. Conclusion. The choice before us. The statistics are undeniable. Modern warfare kills civilians at rates that dwarf military casualties. This transformation represents more than tactical evolution. It's a moral crisis that challenges basic assumptions about civilization and human progress. Behind every statistic is a human being. A teacher trying to educate children during bombardment, a doctor treating patients in a hospital that might be bombed tomorrow, a family trying to maintain normal life while their city becomes a battlefield. This reality wasn't inevitable. It resulted from specific choices that can potentially be changed. We have the knowledge, technology, and legal frameworks to dramatically reduce civilian casualties. What we need is the moral courage and political will to implement them. The question facing humanity is simple. Will we continue accepting a system where grocery store clerks are more likely to die in war than trained soldiers, or will we demand fundamental change? As UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres stated, protecting civilians is not just a legal obligation, it is a moral imperative that defines our humanity. When we fail to protect civilians in warfare, we fail as a species. The children playing in today's war zones deserve better than becoming statistics in tomorrow's casualty reports. The choice between civilization and barbarism is ultimately a choice between protecting civilians and continuing to treat them as expendable. Thanks for watching, my friend. Please like and subscribe.